Okay, people, today's video is going to be about the illusion of agency. And what we're talking about really is sandboxing versus railroading in Dungeons and Dragons, and in fact, any role-playing game. So the idea of sandboxing is essentially where you have a game where the players can go anywhere, do anything, pick up anything. They have complete agency to do what they want. You provide, as the dungeon master, a vast, exciting, and interesting world, and the players, without being told what to do, have the ability to choose what they're going to do. They can go anywhere, do anything, etc. Now, a railroad, on the other hand, being the exact opposite of that, the other extreme, is where the players are essentially railroaded into a storyline by the dungeon master. And the extreme version of that is where they feel they have no agency, they're being pushed down a tunnel, there are no exits, there's just one way, and there's a boulder behind you. And this creates a situation where, as a player, you feel you don't have any agency and you can't do anything, and you're basically trapped following the storyline that's been pre-configured for you, and you are unable to make any kind of meaningful impact on the world. So yeah, as a player, when you get into a sandbox environment, you tend to feel like you've got more power and control, that you've got more choices available to you. And to me, the real trick is to balance this notion of a sandbox and this notion of a railroad somewhere in between. I think a lot of DMs these days are coming to the conclusion that this is, in fact, the better type of game, where you have a lot of options, but there's also a story. And if not one story, there may in fact be multiple threads on which you can pick up at any time, drop them at any time, move from one quest line to another, change factions, change alliances, change your motivations. You're not being railroaded to do any one thing. A good example of this sort of thing, like one way of explaining this, is that the DM might have, for example, spent a lot of time designing a dungeon, and they've created a bad guy, and they've got a bunch of loot and treasure that they are planning to give you when you achieve this certain, these conditions. And the DM is likely to find ways to force you to do this. And if the DM is not creative about this, it will feel like a railroad, which is bad, usually for most players, this feeling that you've been robbed of your agency. So what we want to talk about is creating the illusion of agency, the illusion of total agency. So my goal as a dungeon master is to create the illusion of total agency. And the way to do that is to essentially trick the players into thinking they can do anything they want. Give them the opportunity to do anything they want. But what you're going to do as a DM is you're going to subtly, and subtly that's the key word here, is to guide them back onto the track that you've actually pre-configured. So let's say, you've set up this epic bad guy who's terrorizing the world, and the players are like, hey, we don't really want to deal with that guy. We're gonna go and start a brewery. Okay, well, so you let them start their brewery. You give them the opportunity to start their brewery. Let them think about what are all the things that they need to start a brewery. They're going to need, all these resources. They're going to need money. Oh, look, you've run out of money. How are you going to get money? Well, one of the obvious ways is going to be for the players to do some adventuring. So that's one way they could get money, and that could easily tie back into your main quest line. Another really obvious way is to have an NPC come into the picture who needs the players to do this, and offer them the money to help them with the main quest line. Or, you can go even further with this. You can have various ways that the main quest line begins to impact the player's ability to fulfill their own objectives. So then they want to fulfill the main quest line for their own reasons, not because you're trying to push them down that road. And that, my friend, is the illusion of agency. So when you get the players to actually choose to do it rather than forcing them to do it. Now, another really important thing, I think, personally, in setting up this illusion of agency is the setup. You've got to get the setup right. Now, you can, no doubt, and it's been done, you can bring your players in and you can say, right, here are your blank character sheets, go away and fill them in and come back with your character sheets and we'll start. And you can do that, and it might work. And if you're a great DM, it might be really good, and that's fine. But if you want to tune it, if you want to make a highly tuned role-playing environment where the characters are going to fit into the narrative that you've designed, and it's in fact going to work optimally, and it's going to work optimally, What you might consider doing is something along the lines of getting the players to understand a little bit about the world beforehand. The more they know about their own character's background, um, and how those characters can fit in together. If you can get the characters, if you can get the players to create characters that already have reasons to be working together from the outset, you can do a lot less work in terms of trying to force them to play together from the very beginning. This session zero idea is a great idea, and it really works. I'm just going to give you an example if you hold the line. What I have here is a letter that I produced for my players. You can't really see it because the Zoom background is kind of messing with it, but you can kind of see there's a stamp on it. Okay, I'm gonna read it to you. So this letter says, "In the name of Her Royal Highness Queen Claresca of Scartabel, Empress of the Northern Sky Reaches, Supreme Regent of the lands of Muldrea, and Sovereign of the kingdoms of Thrain, Belcanard, and Gwil, and by the ordinance of the Council of the High Wardens." And then there's a title space and a name space that you can fill in as a player, right? And I send this to the players in advance as a PDF or as a picture document. And it says, "So-and-so, the player, is hereby appointed under official contract to the Order of the Crown Justice to respectfully assume the title and responsibilities of a civil justice warden for the period of 1 year and 1 day, being assigned to the municipality of the township of," this is the name of the town the game is set in, "within the northern reaches of the kingdom of Muldrea alone, or until such a time as the matter of civil unrest at said locale has been settled in righteous justice and according to law. Signed by the Right Honourable Lord Duncan of Gwylaw, Premonstrator of Justice and Mercy to the Northern Realm." And then we have his signature and a little stamp on the picture, right? Now, this is just a handout. I'll link you a picture of it in the thing. But the point of this handout is that every player gets this handout before the beginning of the game. And this is obviously just an example. Obviously, this is not going to work for every game. This is a very specific example. But every player in my game received this handout, and instantly I had a group of players who all, no matter what their backgrounds or who they were all working for one reason, for one thing in one location, and they all had a reason to meet at one time in one place. And this solved unending problems. Okay. It also allowed me to introduce not one, but two new players into the game over several consecutive weeks. Seamlessly. Players were able to enter the game and potentially could leave and come back again, using this meta construct that allows them to be part of the story. The point here is that the players turned up in this town and there was a mystery to solve, and they knew why they were there from the very outset. They even had this handout before they made their characters, so they knew what to expect and what sort of characters they probably should make. And they had an idea of how to approach that from the start. This allows you to get straight into the game as quickly as possible, and you can just launch the game right in the action, in the middle of things, as they say. And so that's a great way of introducing players to your campaign or your scenario or your one shot. This was supposed to be a one shot. It turned out these 5 players have become a campaign. They finished the one shot adventure. They dragged it out for 4 sessions. I think they liked it, and they decided they wanted to keep playing these characters. They had to hand in their formal Justice Warden certificates after the main plot had finished, and they moved to a bigger city, and they're continuing with the campaign. And I think that was a good start. And by doing this, I ended up with a group of players who all knew why they were there, and they didn't feel railroaded because they had bought into the idea from the very beginning. They knew what they were about. And that made it fun to them. Now, I'm running another campaign called Oathbound, where I have a few players who are all playing Elven Paladins. Now, that sounds really restrictive, doesn't it? They can all heal, they can all smite, and they all belong to an order who's sent them on a particular series of missions and will continue to do so, which allows me to bind them together. Now, it turns out I hear from reading Tasha's guide information that's coming up around the internet that they're introducing this whole patron thing going on where people can have a group patron, which is basically something that DMs have been doing for years, which D&D has finally cottoned on to. Like other games like Vampire the Masquerade have been doing this for aeons, and it works really well. Why wouldn't you do it? Have the players all work for someone. I don't know, makes sense to me, and it's been a thing forever. So if the players can all buy into the idea that they all actually work for somebody and that somebody sends them on missions like a quest giver, you know, as if it was a video game even, that can solve a lot of problems. But when you've got a sandbox environment and you're starting with a sandbox and you want to give the players the feeling of a sandbox, what you have to remember is that, and I think this is one of the most important things about running a sandbox, is that you have to know your world and you have to know your characters, okay? You have to know your NPCs. Knowing the characters, the player characters, knowing what their backgrounds are, knowing what motivates them, knowing what triggers them, what pushes their buttons, because they should all have triggers and they should all have buttons that you can press. If they haven't built buttons into their characters that you as the DM can press, they haven't really made characters. They've made cardboard cutouts, and there's not a lot you can do with that. Honestly, you can kill orcs and kick in doors, and that's about the limit of your role playing in that situation. You know, you might be lucky to get someone who's a really good role player who can bring something to the table beyond that. But that's going to be the lowest common denominator, and it's going to be, you're going to be hard pressed to get any serious role playing beyond that out of them. If you've got players who have built triggers into their characters, buttons to press, flaws, problems, inner conflict, where they're divided because on the one hand, you know, my father happens to be Lord Duncan, and Lord Duncan is he's a tyrant, and on the other hand, you're a good paladin who opposes tyranny. In a conflict, right? Suddenly you've got an interesting character. It's 10 times more interesting than a character who doesn't give a shit about anything. Basically, we're describing an edgelord here. So yeah, edgelord bad, inner conflict characters good, have triggers, have, you know, build something into your character, a real character, please. If you need to, buy a book on screenwriting and read it, because this will improve your ability to tell stories. I don't suggest you read books on novel writing or playwriting or various other types of writing. I'm not saying don't read those and that you won't get anything from them, but if you want to get something fast from something, read a book about screenwriting. Those are the best books to learn about these types of narratives that work for role playing as a medium. It is more akin to movies and television series than it is to novels and plays, in my opinion. Maybe plays. And also, I mean, there's not to say there's nothing to be learned from any of those other mediums. There's always something to be learned from everything. Never stop learning. The next thing you need to know is your non-player characters. You know about your player characters, you know their triggers, you know their inner conflicts, right? Now you need to know about your non-player characters. And this is super, 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 super important because they are the rest of the world. You know, I mean, you got your landscape and your history and your backstory and all of that stuff, and that's all real important too. But you know who your NPCs are, know what motivates your NPCs, know what they want. This is like acting 101. And this sounds really pretentious, but you know, what's my motivation? What's my motivation in this scene? Like, honestly, if you don't know your motivation in the scene, you're kind of dead weight. You're going to be pushing shit uphill. You're going to be playing a cardboard cutout. You're going to be wooden. You're going to have nothing to offer. Right? So know who your NPCs are and know what they want. Now, one thing that I learned, one of the coolest things that I ever came across when I was learning to be a dungeon master or a game master was there's a book for the game Vampire the Masquerade called Chicago by Night. It's an old book, and I don't know if you can even get it anywhere except maybe as a PDF online. I'm pretty sure you can get it from various online stores. And it's probably not very expensive. But in any case, the Vampire the Masquerade supplements are really awesome for learning how to be a DM, funnily enough, because they will show you how to create a chart that maps the relationships of all the NPCs and all the factions in a way that makes sense and allows you to understand this intricate net of politics and emotional ties and bonds between the NPCs. So when you pull on this little part of the web over here, you end up causing all of these other little ripples to go out across the net. And this affects the game world. So the players are actually interacting with the whole world. Every time you say something here, you say something to this NPC, that NPC is going to go and talk to that NPC. And now these little snippets of information are going to get out there, and there's going to be rumors generated, and there's going to be information passed in the background. Now, one of the things that Matt Colville says, and I'm going to have to say I don't agree with him. There's few things that I don't agree with Matt Colville on. I think he's an amazing YouTuber and an amazing DM and an amazing person. Honestly, he's an incredible creative person. But I don't agree with him about everything. And the thing that I particularly don't agree with him on, he says that when an actor leaves the stage, the character dies. I get his point. Okay, I understand what he's saying. Basically, what he's saying is that when you're on, and when you're not on, you don't need to be on, and you can be thinking about other stuff. I get that. Okay. But I'm going to say to you that what if you are playing your NPC and you're in a scene with your NPC and the players say something or do something, and then your NPC leaves and they continue to talk. The players are now talking. You've got your players role playing, for example, and this is the best part of the game, in my view. This is the point where you can sit back and watch. When you're sitting back and watching the players role playing, interacting with each other, and you are able to do that for extended periods of time, you have done your job. Okay. Now, either they're planning or they're discussing some kind of ethical thing, or they're just purely role playing for the sake of it because they love your game world that much. Right. And or they love their characters that much. Either way, it doesn't matter. The point is they're now role playing. And when they're doing that, this is when you take your NPCs who are, according to Matt Colville, they're dead because they're not on screen anymore. They're not on the stage, so they're dead. This is where you take those NPCs and you think about them. You get into those characters, you get into their mindsets, and you think, well, what are they thinking? What are they doing? What is the king of blah doing right now? What is his servant thinking? You can imagine all the other scenes that are going on in the world, around the world, while the players are doing that stuff. And then you can weave that information back into the game. This is how you sandbox. This is the way to sandbox. You are playing all of those NPCs. You are living those NPCs and bringing them to life. And if you don't do that, every time you see an NPC, they haven't changed. Now, this is an important thing, okay? So we're going to talk about character development and character arcs. So not only should the player characters have a character arc, I mean, this is my opinion, right? They don't have to have a character arc. You can have a player character go through the entire story, basically like the Incredible Hulk, and never change. Every episode's the same. Walk into a new town, there's a problem, solve the problem, leave the town, everybody's impressed. Okay, that's nice. We've seen that a million times. That is a formula, and it does work, and it may work in your game, and you might be happy with that. I think and in fact, as far as a sandbox goes, I have to say, I don't think that's a sandbox. I think that's something else. It's more of a railroad. You're going into a story. There's a pre-configured story. You've got a crime to solve. You've got a baddie to beat. The town's doing something. The town's got a problem. You have to solve it. But it's always this small defined area in which you have no real agency beyond. I mean, you can leave it and then you just leave the story, and that's the end of the story. You go to another town, new problem, do the same thing again. Okay, so on the other hand, if you're in a game where every time you see an NPC, they have developed, they've done something, they've achieved something, they've changed in some way, they've learned something, their attitude has changed, their attitude towards you have changed, they've learned something about you, they've learned something about themselves, they've learned something about the world. Even if they've changed their hair color, or if they've changed clothes, they've changed the way they dress, they've earned more money, they've got a horse instead of a donkey. Okay, these tell you things about those characters, and it brings those characters to life. Don't have static NPCs. It's boring. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. Not every NPC is going to change every single time you see them. The town guard might be the most static character in the whole game. He might be the same for years. And there are people who don't change in real life, right? But think about all the people that do change in real life and how they learn and grow over time. And if you apply that fact to the NPCs in your game, and you apply it to the way they interact with your player characters, I think you'll find that your game develops in a much more interesting way. Okay, so this character development and character arcs in regards to NPCs, this ties into consequences, right? Because NPCs also have plans and motives. They have long-term plans and short-term plans. They've got objectives and super objectives. And they have reactions. They react to stuff. They react to stuff that the players do, and they react to other stuff as well. A really obvious example is, the king is being a bastard, and he's collecting all the magic weapons in the world. This is an example from my game. And he's collecting all the magic artifacts, and magic is becoming scarce because of it. No, I'm oversimplifying. Um, and so now you've got characters who are magicians and the collectors and purveyors of magic who are put out because all their magic items are being confiscated by the king. Right, so they're going to react to that. How do they react to it? Well, either they're going to react to it through speech, through their attitudes. They're going to join forces with other people that feel the same way. They may even contract the player characters, or they might find that the player characters have the same sorts of issues, and they ally with them. Have you ever been in a game where, for example, you're sitting there as a player and you're waiting for the DM to do something, and the DM's looking at you when he's waiting for you to do something, or she, and nobody's doing anything, and the game suddenly stagnates? Okay, so this is very easy to happen, and this can very easily happen in a sandbox environment, right? Because the DM's really waiting for you to choose something to do because it's a sandbox, right? Now the DM at that point needs to instigate something, right? This is where it can't just be a sandbox. This is why I think that the sandbox versus railroad is a fallacy, actually. What it really has to be about is the DM has to instigate something with you if you're not doing something. But this is the point. As a DM in a sandbox, what you need to do is you need to be watching and gauging the players' engagement with the game, with the story, with each other. If they're happily role playing with each other, and they're already talking and they're already doing stuff and they already have a sense of the world and you can see they're engaged, you need to stand back. You need to learn that you do not need to interfere with what they're doing. If they're already role playing, you do not need to interfere. This wrecks it for them. You can come into a scene where the players are already role playing and you've got some information that may or may not be relevant. And if it is relevant, that's okay. Come in with your information, but make it quick, make it decisive, make it clear, and then get back out again. Let them go back to their role playing. That's what they're here for. If indeed that is what they're here for. But if it is, you need to leave them alone and not interfere with them. If you really feel that you have to be part of that scene, what you need to do as a DM is you need to bring an NPC into the scene. What you should not do is download 5 pages of lore, descriptions of the weather, geography, and other details while they're role playing, because you're wrecking their flow. They're flowing. They've got their flow going, right? As an actor, I'm talking about this from a professional point of view. You do not want a director while you're acting in a play. If the director stops you every 5 minutes, or not even every 5 minutes, every 5 seconds, and is like, okay, stop. Okay, and I just want to talk about the way that you touch your button. Right? This is not helpful direction. That's not useful. You're not adding anything to the story. You're just pissing people off. Okay, so don't do that. Don't be that DM. Be the DM that has the control and the discipline to sit back like a film director and watch your actors role play. That's what you need to do. And if you do need to get into the scene because you're not having fun anymore, that can happen. Maybe you're bored, or maybe you want to change it up a bit. You want to change gears. So now you bring in an NPC. Now you bring in an NPC that has something to say and something that's actually going to affect the scene. If the players have been role playing like this for a little while now, they've been talking, they're talking about things, they're talking about the weather, they're talking about what they're doing, they're talking about the plan, they're talking about the plot, and they're lulled into this false sense of security. That's your objective. Lull the players into a false sense of security in a sandbox environment. Let them think they're in control. Let them think they have all the agency in the world, and then you hit them with something. Then Servant B runs in and says, "Oh my God, the lard is on fire. Oh my God, the orcs are attacking." Or, "I've just discovered that King Blah is doing the thing that's going to set off the thing, and Jack the Blah is going to fight the thing, and all the world's going to fall apart." Okay. You don't just sit back when you've got them lulled. Now's the point where you up the ante, raise the stakes, raising stakes. Okay. So these are storytelling techniques. So you want to remember that conflict is drama. And that means inner conflict. It means outer conflict. It means interpersonal conflict. It's I'm going to use like the terms from screenwriting, okay? But the terms that they use are man versus self, inner conflict, man versus the environment. Okay, so this is climbing rocks and making checks for jumping buildings, okay? So man versus environment, man versus self, man versus man, man versus group, right? Group versus group. This is another type of conflict. And then you get into much bigger things where you have nations against each other and so on and so forth. You can extrapolate that as far as you want. But conflict is drama. Remember that conflict is drama. Okay. The next really important thing is that in terms of making tension work in your game, you need to raise the stakes. Continue to raise the stakes. If you have every scene as a fight scene, if every scene is a massive epic battle, nobody's going to care in 5 minutes. After you've been through 3 epic battles, nobody cares. Now, I mean, just to put this into perspective, I'm a massive Transformers fan. I was a big Transformers fan since I was a kid. I love Transformers so badly, right? So much. Transformers, awesome. Giant fighting robots, awesome, right? I went to see the first Transformers movie. It was awesome. It blew me away. It was all my childhood hopes and dreams come to life. Fantastic. Okay. I watched the second Transformers film. Okay, cool. Yeah. Giant fighting robots, more of them. Awesome. Yeah. Story, blah. Okay. We get to like the 3rd one and the 4th one and the 5th one, however many there are. And there actually comes a point where me personally, as a massive fan of Transformers and giant fighting robots in general, I got bored. I was shocked. I was blown away by the fact that I was bored with giant fighting robots, because there comes a point where I am saturated, where I've seen enough giant fighting robots and it means nothing anymore because the stakes are gone. So if you're going to run a sandbox campaign, that's okay, definitely awesome, but have some stakes, right? You need to raise the stakes. It can't just be the players want to form a thing and make a brewery and own a shop. Okay, that's fine. Or, maybe they want to start a war or have a castle. Well, now the stakes are getting raised because these things are putting impositions on your NPCs. Your NPCs might have ideas of their own. They don't want a castle next door to them. They don't want a force amassing next to their town. There's all sorts of reasons why NPCs might get peeved about what the players' plans are, but definitely let the players have plans. Let the players develop their plans. Let their plans see some success. But no plan, and I'm not going to use the no plan survives contact with the enemy because that's tropey and boring and we've all heard it before. But how many times have you ever planned something and it's gone perfectly exactly as you imagined or hoped it would? Never, almost never, maybe once in a million. Occasionally that might work. But the truth is it's more interesting if there's conflict, because conflict is drama. Raise the stakes. So if you're running a sandbox, you want to look at ways to raise the stakes. So you need NPCs that you understand, who are part of a network, right, of ties, bonds, and relationships, who communicate with each other behind the scenes so that information is happening and being passed around. They have attitudes towards each other. Some of them hate each other. Some of them like each other. Some of them are indifferent. Some of them have histories. Some of those histories may be good or bad or indifferent, or that might depend on the context in which the players walk into the scene. But in any case, you need to really understand your NPCs, and you need to use those NPCs carefully and well. Also, so another thing about a sandbox is that as a DM, your job is to be dynamic. Now, what I mean by being dynamic as a DM, is that you have to be ready to shift your methods and your means at any time, right? So let's say you're planning, event X is being planned, and you've got it in your mind that NPC Y is going to enact event X. Well, the players kill NPC Y before you can enact event X. So what do you do? Oh no, my plans are broken. Are they really? Really? Is it? No, you just shift your NPC's plans to another NPC. You create a new NPC, and better than that, the players have killed NPC Y. Now NPC X, Y, Z, whatever, has got an even more complicated situation to resolve. They've got even more motives and more interesting things to think about. And this next scene that you've now ended up with is now complicated by more detail, right? This is even more interesting than what you started with. They haven't destroyed your plans. They've made your plans more interesting, right? So you've got to compound the stuff on top of each other, layer the story. Each event, you need to find ways to layer it together and weave it together. These are some of the ways I would suggest that you can create and improve player agency in your game, especially if they feel that they're being railroaded. And if you want to feel like you want to create a sense of a sandbox environment, but at the same time, you want to have an interesting game where things are happening. Another thing that works really well for running your sandbox environment is to pay attention to which NPCs that the players like role-playing with, that they respond to. Okay, so if you've got an NPC that you're good at playing, like for example, I've got some NPCs that I can really get into and I can play them, and they've got a really strong voice, and the players know exactly who they're talking to when they're meeting that NPC. And there are other NPCs who are much more random, who I haven't had a chance to develop yet, who honestly, they often sound the same, and sometimes the players can't tell the difference between them, right? So what you want to do is look for opportunities to use the NPCs that you are good at. You know, you want to play to your strengths, right? Don't bring in NPCs that you suck at playing, because they're not going to respond. The players are not going to respond to those NPCs as much. So you want the players to have fun. Bring in NPCs that they like. Bring in NPCs that are charismatic or they hate. One of those things. They've got to love them or hate them, but a strong emotion, you need to evoke a strong emotion with your NPCs one way or the other. I mean, definitely there are characters that don't need to have strong voices, that don't need to be evocative, but they're not the ones that are driving the plot. Those are shopkeepers, right? That's the bartender or the stable boy, you know, or the assistant to the Lord Duncan. Okay, these are not important characters usually. Sometimes it is one of those characters, and they are interesting and they are funny, or they are, for whatever reason, you know, if you've got a humorous character, if you've got a gag going with this particular character, yeah, use it, go for it. You know, these are things. But the thing with a sandbox is that you're not on a time limit. Okay, so you're not in a contained environment where you have any sort of time pressure, where there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And so what you have to do is create a kind of an episodic feel, and you have to have, okay, so what storyliners do in television is they don't just have one storyline. They have multiple storylines overarching each other. So when one plot is resolving, the next plot line is taking off, and a third plot line is in the middle. And this is happening. They're going over each other constantly. Doof, 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 doof. So you never just have one plot line resolving. You've always got at least three plots happening at the same time. And this, I think, is an important way to manage a sandbox environment. Have three things going on, at least. Three different main quest lines happening simultaneously, overlapping one another, or at different points in their arcs and development. In the same way that a television series will do this. It's very clever. It works really well, and you'll be amazed at the results. So yeah, so these are my tips on running a sandbox environment, and how a sandbox can differ from a railroad, or how you can use railroady techniques at times to make your sandbox work. Sorry for the terrible video quality and the flares I'm getting in my screen. I'm hoping to resolve a lot of these issues in the weeks to come, because I'm getting, hopefully, some new equipment. Yay! And that will make the whole production value, that'll make the whole production value of this channel improve with any luck. So yeah, thanks again for coming. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around. Please subscribe. I really appreciate your subscriptions. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching, and over and out.